The Pacific War left its survivors scattered like wreckage. Among them were Japanese women captured during the final years of fighting, ferried across the ocean to American camps where they lived behind fences, surrounded by the very men they had been taught to fear. To them, captivity meant humiliation. They braced themselves for cruelty, chains, or worse. Yet what awaited them inside those camps unsettled them far more deeply than punishment ever could. The barracks were lined in neat rows, wooden walls creaking in the wind, bunks stacked tightly together. Guards patrolled with rifles, their boots crunching on gravel. For the women, the nights were the hardest. After laboring by day in kitchens or laundries, they returned to barracks that felt unbearably empty, filled with silence heavier than exhaustion. It was during those nights that they discovered the shock that would mark their captivity forever. Their guards, American soldiers, often slept just beyond the thin walls, sometimes in the same buildings, their breathing audible through the night. At first, terror ruled their thoughts. To lie in darkness, knowing men with rifles rested only a few feet away, was unbearable. Every sound, a cough, a shift on a bunk, the metallic click of a belt buckle, echoed through the barracks like thunder. The women whispered to each other, voices trembling, imagining what might come. They had been told by their leaders that Americans were brutal, that capture would mean dishonor worse than death. Now they waited in silence for that dishonor to fall upon them. But it never came. Night after night, the soldiers lay down, wrapped themselves in blankets, and simply slept. No taunts, no violations, no laughter through the walls. Only silence, the occasional snore, and the rhythm of men as weary as they were. The women were stunned. One prisoner scribbled in her hidden notebook, "The graveyard." The shock grew deeper as weeks passed. The women expected eventually to be tested, to face the cruelty they had been warned of. But instead, they discovered something stranger. The men who slept beside them were human, disciplined, restrained. They carried rifles, but not cruelty. They looked, they hesitated, but they did not cross the line. That silence, that constant nearness without violation, became the most unsettling truth of all. One prisoner wrote later, "I feared dishonor more than death, yet the dishonor never came. What I cannot bear is the memory of their restraint. It proved us wrong. It proved everything we believed about them was a lie." As winter deepened, the barracks became a place of uneasy coexistence. The women lay awake listening to the guards breathe, sometimes hating them, sometimes pitying them, sometimes wondering about the lives they had left behind. The soldiers, lying equally restless, wondered the same. A few confessed quietly in their journals that the war had made them soldiers, but captivity had made them men again, men forced to confront the strange intimacy of sleeping beside those they had been trained to despise. The story of those nights was not written in battles or victories, but in silence, in the unspoken shock of restraint. For the Japanese women, the nearness of American soldiers was a constant reminder of danger and of mercy. And it was this contradiction, lived night after night in wooden barracks, that they would carry with them long after the war ended. The barracks settled each evening into uneasy quiet, but the quiet was never complete. Every sound echoed, carrying weight it would not have borne in ordinary life. A cough in the darkness became a reminder of captivity. A shifting bunk meant a reminder that the enemy was only an arm's length away. The women grew accustomed to listening, to every creak of the wooden floors, every muttered word in English they could not understand, every sigh that drifted through the thin walls. At first, this nearness felt unbearable. They lay rigid in their bunks, muscles tense, clutching thin blankets to their chins as though cloth could shield them. They whispered to one another, voices trembling, speaking of shame, dishonor, and fear. Their leaders had told them Americans were barbaric, that captivity meant violation, humiliation, the end of everything honorable. That was the burden they carried into those nights. Yet night after night passed, and nothing happened. The soldiers lay down on the other side of the wall, their boots removed, their rifles stacked in corners, and they simply slept. This silence was more difficult to endure than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they could have hated, could have met with defiance. But restraint, this unseen wall of discipline, confused them, unsettled them, broke the narratives they had been taught. Some women began to whisper of it, not with relief, but with suspicion. "They wait," one muttered. "They want us to relax, and then—" She stopped, unable to finish. Another shook her head. "No, they are different than we thought." In truth, the soldiers themselves were locked in battle every night. They were young men, many not much older than the women, sons of farmers and shopkeepers, boys who had seen friends die on beaches and in jungles. Now they stood guard over their enemies not with bullets, but with silence. The proximity tested them. They admitted as much in letters never sent, in journals tucked under pillows. One soldier wrote, "It is the hardest duty I have faced, to hear them breathing, to know they are near, to feel temptation, and yet to do nothing. War taught me to kill. Captivity teaches me to resist myself." The women began to notice the small things, the way a soldier avoided looking directly at them when he passed food, the way he coughed and looked away if their eyes met, the way he hesitated as though wrestling with unspoken thoughts. These gestures carried more meaning than words. They spoke of desire restrained, of boundaries held, of men torn between duty and longing. One stormy night, rain hammered the roofs and wind rattled the windows. Water seeped in, soaking bunks, leaving women shivering. In the darkness, they heard movement outside, boots splashing in puddles. Then the door creaked open and a guard stepped in, dropping a pile of extra blankets on the floor. He said nothing, left quickly, his uniform soaked. The women froze, staring at the blankets as though they were weapons. Then slowly they reached for them, wrapping themselves in warmth. The gesture became the subject of whispered debate for days. One woman said, "It is a trick." Another answered softly, "No, it is mercy." The shock grew heavier with time. They expected the worst. Instead, they found the strangest form of dignity. That dignity hurt more than cruelty might have. It forced them to confront their own beliefs, to admit that their enemy possessed honor. One wrote secretly, "I do not understand them. They do not humiliate us. They do not harm us. They only sleep. It frightens me because it proves they are not the monsters we were told." The soldiers, too, were haunted. They lay awake, listening to whispers in a language they did not know, the soft cadence of lullabies, the sound of women weeping quietly into their pillows. Some confessed that these sounds followed them into their dreams, haunting them more deeply than gunfire ever had. A guard wrote, "I have fought men, but this is harder. To hear them cry and not comfort them, to hear them whisper and not answer, it is a silence that feels like a wound." As weeks turned to months, a strange rhythm developed. The women and soldiers existed in parallel lives, separated by duty, yet bound by proximity. They shared the same nights, the same storms, the same creaks of the barracks, but not the same words. They became, in a way, companions without contact. Each side knew the other's presence intimately, without ever touching. The tension sharpened during moments of crisis. One night a prisoner fell ill, fever burning through her body. Her companions panicked, fearing she would die. The guards heard the commotion and entered. One of them, awkward and embarrassed, knelt to help, bringing water, adjusting blankets, calling for a medic. The women stared, astonished, as he worked. Afterward, they whispered in awe. He touched her hand only to cool her skin, nothing more. That restraint again stunned them. Another night, a soldier's harmonica drifted through the darkness. At first, the women froze, unsure whether to remain silent. But slowly, one began to hum. Another joined, then another. The music filled the barracks, a fragile bridge of sound connecting captor and captive. A diary later recorded, "It was only a tune, nothing more. Yet it felt as though the walls melted. For a moment I forgot where I was." The greatest shock was not in a single act, but in the constancy of it. Night after night, week after week, the soldiers remained near, always close enough to take, yet never taking. The women began to realize that this discipline was not weakness, but strength. It unsettled them deeply, forcing them to reevaluate not only their enemy, but themselves. One prisoner wrote years later, "I braced for violation and instead met silence. That silence was heavier than any touch. It revealed a strength I did not expect. It shamed me because it proved our hatred was built on lies." The soldiers carried similar scars. Many admitted privately that they longed, that they dreamed, that temptation gnawed at them. But they also carried pride, the pride of restraint, of holding the line not against enemy fire, but against themselves. One said later in life, "I not ever fired a bullet in that camp, but every night I fought a battle." The women's perception shifted slowly. At first they saw the nearness of soldiers as a threat, then as a confusion, finally as a paradox. They remained prisoners, but they also remained women, seen but untouched, feared yet respected. That paradox marked them for life. It was not cruelty that scarred them most, but kindness withheld, desire restrained, mercy unspoken. By the time whispers of war's end reached the camp, the women understood that these nights would follow them forever. They would return home with memories they could never share, that they had slept each night within reach of their captors, and that what shocked them most was not violation, but its absence. The soldiers, too, knew they would never forget. The war had made them killers, but captivity had made them guardians, protectors of boundaries unspoken but unbreakable. For both sides, the shock of those nights was not what happened, but what never did. The summer of 1945 broke with a silence deeper than any before. Word passed through the camps like a current. Japan had surrendered. The war that had swallowed oceans, cities, and millions of lives was over. For the Japanese women behind the wire, the news arrived with disbelief. They sat on their bunks, clutching thin blankets, staring at each other in stunned silence. They had survived captivity, survived fear, survived months of nights where their enemy slept only steps away. Now the war had ended, but the memory of those nights would not leave them. At first, the women braced for the worst. Defeat meant disgrace. They feared Americans would finally cast off restraint, that now, without war's rules, they would be punished. But the nights continued as before. The soldiers unrolled blankets, stacked their rifles, and simply slept. The silence, once unbearable, now became haunting. Why had they been spared? Why had nothing happened? One woman whispered to another in the dark, "We were told they would destroy us. They only slept. They wanted, and yet they did not take. That is harder to understand than hatred." The guards were equally restless. They knew the women would soon be sent home. Their duty, once so rigid, now felt fragile, temporary. A young soldier wrote in his pocket journal, "Soon they will leave. I never touched them, never spoke beyond orders, yet I feel as though I lose something I cannot name. The hardest fight of this war was not on a battlefield. It was here, in silence, each night beside them." Farewell came in slow waves. Trucks pulled up outside the camps, carrying women toward ports where ships waited. The guards watched them climb aboard, their boots heavy in the dust. Some exchanged glances that burned hotter than words. Others dared to nod, a silent acknowledgement of all that had been endured without being spoken. One woman later wrote, "His eyes followed me as I left. He said nothing. But in his silence I felt seen more clearly than I ever had in my life." On the voyage home, the women stood at ship rails watching America disappear into the horizon. They carried with them memories that no diary could fully contain. They had expected chains, cruelty, humiliation. Instead, they had been shocked by discipline, by desire that remained unfulfilled, by mercy wrapped in silence. It was a paradox they could never explain in Japan. To admit it would have been betrayal. And so they locked the memories away, hidden in whispers revealed only decades later. Back in their homeland, ruins stretched for miles. Families huddled in collapsed houses, food was scarce, cities burned. The women returned carrying secrets heavier than hunger. They spoke of work, of fences, of survival. But they did not tell of the nights when American soldiers slept so near they could hear their dreams, yet never laid a hand on them. That truth remained buried, shared only in secret diaries or in trembling confessions years later. For the Americans, the memory lingered too. Guards who had once walked night patrols admitted later in life that they had never forgotten. Some wrote in old age, "I heard them breathe, I heard them cry, and I fought myself every night. I am proud I never crossed the line, but I will never forget how near we were." Others kept the memory silent, ashamed of how much it had meant to them. They had faced battlefields without fear, but the nearness of those women had tested them more than bullets ever could. Historians often leave these stories untouched. They prefer maps, treaties, casualty counts. But in the margins of war lived another history, the shock of restraint, the unspoken intimacy of enemies forced into proximity. The Japanese women were not shocked by cruelty. They were shocked by its absence. They were shocked that their captors, who held power over them every night, chose silence instead of violation. One woman in old age finally admitted to her granddaughter, "I feared dishonor more than death, yet dishonor never came. What I cannot forget is the way they slept so near, the way they did not take what they could. That restraint haunted me more than any violence could have." Another said simply, "We hated them, and yet we owed them. They gave us dignity when we expected shame." The legacy of those nights was not written in books, but in silence passed from generation to generation. The women lived lives outwardly, ordinary, marriages, children, work. But in quiet moments, in the stillness of night, they remembered the sound of boots removed, of blankets unrolled, of men settling into sleep only steps away. For the Americans, the memory endured in another form. Veterans who had stood guard admitted decades later that they remembered those women more clearly than battles fought across the Pacific. One confessed, "I do not remember the names of villages. I remember the sound of women whispering through thin walls. That is what stayed with me." The shock on both sides was the same: restraint. The discovery that even in war, when hatred was demanded, humanity could survive in silence. It unsettled them because it contradicted everything they had been taught. It proved that their enemies were not monsters, but men and women bound by the same instincts, the same longings, the same fears. And so the story endured, not in official records, but in private memories. The Japanese women who slept each night beside their captors carried the paradox to their graves. The American soldiers who restrained themselves carried pride and regret in equal measure. The shock was not in what happened, but in what did not, and could not. When asked in later life what haunted her most about captivity, one woman answered, "The silence, always the silence, because in that silence we were more human than in all the noise of war." And perhaps that is the truest legacy of those nights, that even in captivity, even in war, humanity revealed itself not in acts of violence, but in the absence of them.